It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you today on the Happiness Festival, Professor Bill Eimicke from Columbia University.
So I am a product of poverty from New York City. My father worked at minimum wage in a factory. My mother stayed at home. We had 4 kids. My family was proud, so they never took government assistance. I went to public schools. My father, no matter what grades I brought home, said, "Can't you do better?" Even though he didn't graduate high school, nor did my mother. So for whatever combination of God-given ability and parental guidance, I pursued school. That was my avenue. I didn't want to work in a factory, so I went all the way through school, and not knowing any better, I kept going till there were no more degrees. So once I got a PhD, I was done. It turned out to be a good thing because I was an athlete when I was young, and I wanted to be a high school teacher and a coach. That was my goal. I never got to be a coach, but I did get to be a teacher, but it turned out at university. And it's still with me. 40, almost 50 years later, I'm still teaching because I have focused on public policy. My father's idol was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who many people view as one of the great presidents, if not the greatest president of the United States, because he used government as a force for good, particularly to help the disadvantaged. That ended up, I think, encouraging me to get into the public sector. So I've actually had 2 careers, one as a public official and the other as a teacher.
So tell me, Bill,
yes, sir.
How do you feel, particularly with FDR, how do you feel like policy can be utilized to create more happiness in the world? Because I'm really interested in what you said about FDR, and I think lots of people would be interested in your ideas in terms of how policy can and should be used to create more happiness in the world.
Well, yeah, this is going to be everything I say is a gross generalization, but in that generalization, there is truth. I think FDR, in many respects, was the epitome of active government. The world in many ways had fallen apart, the worldwide depression, climate problems, world war. It was a mess, right? Everything was a mess. And so he ran for office and ultimately for president, and he won. And for whatever set of complex psychological reasons, he decided that government was going to fix this mess. And he tried almost everything, from Social Security to poverty programs to public works to aiding the allies in Europe. I mean, everything to try to fix what was wrong. And a lot of it worked. And government is a problem. I recently wrote a book with Howard Buffett about public-private partnerships as the solution to government's failure. And to some degree, I think that's true. But we can't forget, we shouldn't forget, that government's a key player in everyone's hope to have happiness, I think. Because part of being happy is, I think, being healthy, being educated, being able to pursue your dream for who you are in life. Well, without education, without healthcare, without food, your chances of happiness are not so great. Many people achieve it anyway. But so I think government's an important ingredient in giving everyone a chance at happiness.
And do you think, in terms of measurements, they say what gets measured gets managed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that policy at the moment is potentially too focused on the arbitrary measures that we are and have been focusing on for some time, like GDP? And if so, what sort of measurements do you think we can start focusing on to make sure that we're creating in a happier world?
So that, I hate when people say this, but I can't resist. That's a great question. It really is. It's a great question. And I agree with the statement. I think we tend to, whatever organization we are, whatever person we are, we tend to have measures of success, and we tend to motivate ourselves and our organizations toward achieving those measures of success. So it is true. What we measure is what we get. And so implicit in your question is financial growth the wrong measure? I don't know. I don't think it's a wrong measure. I think it's wrong to be the only measure. So to the extent that we say, well, the economy is growing, so therefore the fallout of all that is everybody will be better off. That's clearly not true. It's not true. But I think it would also be untrue to say it's irrelevant, because the more wealth we have, the higher the probability that everyone can have good health, that everyone can have enough to eat, that everyone can get educated, that everyone can have a shelter over themselves, on and on and on and on and on. I mean, I do believe there are preconditions. I think it's very difficult to be happy if you're hungry, if you don't have shelter from the rain, if you're not educated. I mean, I'm catching myself now in my own trap, right? Because I would argue that my dog is extremely happy and makes me very happy. And he's not particularly educated. Well, I don't know. That's maybe he is educated by me. I don't know. But I think measurement of happiness is a challenging endeavor. I mean, to some degree, right? I mean, I would think you have to ask. I would have to ask you: are you happy?
They say that happiness is, shouldn't be a destination. It's just part of the journey, So some days I'm happy, some days I'm not. But I think that it's interesting when you look at GDP and you think of all the flaws with GDP, and then you think of all the focus that's given to it from policymakers. And I know there's lots being done in terms of trying to figure out definitions and measurement protocols and indexes around ESG investing, and thinking that if we can really measure impact, then that's going to deliver greater happiness. And then the next question is, well, how do you know if it's delivering greater happiness? How do you measure happiness? And I think the perennial search of measurement to abstract, heavily nuanced things is not easy. But what I really want to understand from you is, I guess, firstly, we can agree that policy is going to be should be set up to make people's lives happier, whatever happiness means to you, right? So how can we, put yourself in the shoes of a 15-year-old, or even someone younger than that, someone younger than that, let's say a 5 to 10-year-old. What sort of policies do you think we should be looking at right now that are going to make the next generation happy? Let's forget measurements, but what sort of policies do you think we should be implementing to make future generations happy as well as ourselves?
I think universal health care is essential. That's number one. I think universal access to education is number two. I think affordable housing for all is number three. Those are three big ones. The fourth one is a little bit more complicated, which is that I believe everyone should have a right to a sustainable income, hopefully derived through some sort of collective engagement, which simplistically I call work. But work could be being a housewife, work could be being a farmer, being an artist, being a thinker, whatever. But I do think we are herd animals. I don't think, again, I can only speak for me, right? I think it's very difficult to be happy without engagement with other cows, with other people like us. So I think it's certainly true for me. I think engagement with other human beings is an important part of my life, and feeling like I'm a full participant in the herd activity in the anthill. So for me, if I said, well, what is your role? So for me, I would say teacher. So I'm a teacher. That's what I give to the collective, and that makes me happy. It makes me feel responsible as well. To me, part of my ability to be happy is a feeling that I'm being responsible. That is, I'm not getting drunk every day and going to the racetrack and winning all my bets, even though those are things I would like to do. If I did that every day, ultimately I would become unhappy because I would feel like I was being irresponsible, and irresponsibility would eat away at my happiness until there was no happiness left.
It's really interesting. There are two words that stand out for me in what you've just said. One is responsibility, and the other is giving. And it feels like what you're saying is that you got to take responsibility for your own happiness first. It's all very well opining and evangelizing for ways that we can all be happier. But actually, if you can look after your hearth, if you can look after your own happiness first, and then take on the mindset of giving part of yourself to others, actually you're then going to create more happiness than actually not focusing on yourself, not taking responsibility for your own actions and your own happiness, and going out into the world and screaming at others for not being happy.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think part of what your project is doing, which I think is really good, is having people share with each other what happiness is to them. Because, I've spent a lot of my life trying to make other people happy. And sometimes I've been successful. Often I've been successful, but sometimes I haven't, no matter how hard I try. And I think part of it is maybe I don't spend enough time trying to understand what makes them happy, not what I can do to help them be happy. And that may sound very unclear, but
no, I understand what you mean. And flipping this back to the state. So, our society, or our nation state, is made up of three elements, right? The state, the market, and society. What role do you think the state has, from a policy perspective, to try and create a more harmonious, a more collaborative, and I guess a happier market? And what sort of policy do you think we should be thinking about? And it could be specific policies, or it could be just the mindset that we need to bring to try and create a happier market, but also a happier society. Is that public-private partnerships, or is there anything else that you can think of that springs to mind?
Well, I think that for me, the state is us, right? The state is a collective. It's all of us. So it's, each sector is really us. It's just we have different hats when we're in it. And maybe there are smaller groups of us. So Google's a group within us. So not everybody's in Google, but everybody is in the state. Well, they're not in every state, like you're in the UK and I'm in the US. We're all in the UN. Well, not everybody's in the US. So, jumping quickly to Star Trek, we're not yet at the point where we govern ourselves. The UN, I think, is the closest, where we govern ourselves as a world. Someday, I believe we will be there. We have institutions so from the world that I've been immersed in for all my life, so I'm really trapped in it, the state to me means the United States, right? Because that's where I live, and that's all of us. And so all of us needs, to me, in my warped mind, it's sort of like we're the referees, owners. We make sure that there's a level playing field with rules for all the subsets of us, the families, the neighborhoods, the corporations, the nonprofits, whatever. And our job as the collective is to make sure that us as individuals can fulfill our dreams, right? Give us the tools. Don't tell us which tools, but give us the overall, the education, the healthcare, a decent place to live, an income. And then let us individually decide what we want to do with that life that we have. So that's not an easy role for us as the state, because we increasingly find ourselves saying, well, everybody should send their kid to school. And like everybody should get the vaccine, because that's for all of us, right? So where's that line between where we enable, but we don't dictate?
It's a really interesting reframe, because it's very simple just to sort of look at the world as the state, the market, and society. But actually, you're 100% right. It's still just made up of all of us, and we're part of all three. And so we need to be able to wear those three hats. And I guess the paradox that I'm seeing is that I really love this idea of us moving from I to we. I think there's a lot of focus over the last 20 years has been on the I, and it's been, people have said that the market is a competition for wealth, and the state is a competition for power, and it's just dominated by the I. If you believe in Darwinian theory, if you believe in Adam Smith, self-interested ideas or self-interested humans perpetuates the sort of prophecy that wealth is created and it's trickled down. And yet it feels like this idea of us moving from I to we is emerging. And so what does we look like in terms of collaboration? Like, can you dig into some examples of what public-private partnerships have done, and how that in your mind has created greater happiness? And then I guess also, how can we, to your first point, how can we be responsible individuals, but also be responsible as a collective?
So another great question. You should be interviewing yourself. That would be a much more effective use of everybody's time. But to take it as a question and give an answer, I would say this. I think the more that we're all engaged in all three sectors, the better outcomes we're going to get. And that's why I think cross-sector partnerships are a good idea, because in the boardroom, if you will, you've got the government, you've got the private sector, and you've got the NGOs. And the government is, in my view, in its best, focused on what's good for everybody. The private for-profit sector is saying, yeah, but we got limited resources. We got to get the most. We got to get the most bang for the buck. Government is terrible at running things. Every time government runs everything, the UK is a perfect story. But so was the Soviet Union, which sounded like a great idea, but it turned out to be terrible. And so was communism in China. China is much better off. I'm not saying China's perfect, but again, capitalism made China better than communism. So the state doesn't do a good job of running, particularly large things, right? It's not a good operator. So the private sector is a good operator, but has no heart. And it doesn't care about everybody. It only cares about it, right? Mark Zuckerberg is trying to be a great person, but in the end, he cares about Facebook, and he can't, no matter how hard he tries, he can't say it's bad for Facebook, but it's good for society. So I'm going to do what's good for society. No. I can't. I just can't. We got to take Donald Trump's advertising, even though it's wrong. We have to, because it's good for Facebook. The NGO sector ideally is mission driven. They're doing what they do because what they do is the right thing. Whether it's healthcare or community involvement or feeding the organization itself is about doing the right thing. So in my simplistic view of the world, that's why cross-sector partnerships are really great, at least in theory, because there's a group in the room that will speak for what's good for everybody, what's efficient, and will use our resources well. And then why are we here in the first place? What's our goal here? Help people, promote health. I always say to my students, it's true. Again, it shows you how warped I am. I will only go to a nonprofit hospital because I don't trust government to run things. And I don't want the doctor saying, wow, geez, if I can get this operation done in 15 minutes, I can do 3 more and I'll make a lot more money. I want the organization to be thinking about what's our goal? Fix this patient. That's what we do. Doesn't matter whether it's efficient, doesn't matter whether he paid his bill, we fix him.
Super interesting. And ignoring the financial reference, but appreciating the sentiment of the question, where does the buck stop then in that scenario, in a cross-sector partnership? Who's in charge?
Well, so if it's a partnership, we're all in charge, right? And so that gets back to your initial question, how do we manage the circles? So the more that we're touching in different places, the more that you and I personally have experience in all 3 sectors, we know what our job is. I work for IX Investment. So, my job on the board is to make sure that IX makes money. But I also am, someone who cares about the environment. So, yeah, well, maybe we'll make money on this deal, but maybe their claim to sustainability is baloney. So now I'm saying, well, we'd make a lot of money, but this really isn't true. So as a board member, I have to say, well, yeah, I understand, but can't we find something that really is sustainable that makes money? So the more we're all experienced and the more the project team has representatives from each sector, the higher the probability that someone with credibility in one area, I'm a great business manager, also has a soul, and my soul comes out. And if my soul doesn't come out, your soul comes out. And so the analogy of everybody being at the table as much as possible, as ridiculous as it sounds, I think is really important. I mean, that's how we can solve a lot of these. If the whole community was somehow represented in policing in the US, we wouldn't be in the fix that we're in. A big part of the problem, and my daughter works for the police department, so I am not anti-police at all. But there's a big problem in policing in the US. And the reason is because policing is in a bubble. It's a bubble. They do their own training. They do their own policing of themselves. They do their own promotions. They're all caught in this bubble, and that's created an us and them, literally, which is appalling for all of us. It's the wrong outcome. If there were a true citizen review board that was part of the police department, that'd be a lot better. If the training of police were done in part by Columbia University and the National Football League, you wouldn't have cops kneeling on somebody's neck. If 4 cops can't subdue Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, they shouldn't be cops. You know, you guys have a different system, and maybe it's hard for you guys to understand how reliant our police force is on guns and individual officers.
But I'd love to know from in a professional, capacity, your career is been hugely successful, and you've given a lot back to a lot of people. And I'd just love to know a story that springs to mind to do with public-private partnerships that you think had a real happy ending.
Another great question. I would say that the thing that I'm most proud of in my external life to date would be my involvement in the production of affordable housing in New York State. And I never knew anything about housing before I got involved in it in the public sector, other than living in a house. I had no exposure to the economics of it. I didn't study it. I had no one in my family who was in construction. I knew nothing about it, but I ended up in a job in where affordable housing fell in my area of responsibility. And it literally was a time where a significant portion of the New York City housing stock was deteriorating and being abandoned by private owners. And the typical response historically was the way government provides housing for poor people is it builds housing and manages housing for poor people, which I learned was not as ridiculous as I came to think it was, because when I looked at the market for housing, I saw that the net rent for private for-profit housing was more than a poor person could pay. In other words, it couldn't be done by the market. It wasn't that the market was refusing to do it, it can't do it. But back to what I said before, if government does it, it doesn't do it well. And that certainly was true about public housing here. So to make a very long story short, we went to the community, we asked them what would be good for them. We had taken huge amounts of private housing in tax foreclosure. So now we, the government, were the owners of things that the private owner just threw away. But there were people living there. So we went to the people and said, well, so some of the people said, help us fix it up. We'll own it. We'll take care of it. So we said, okay. And then some said, well, we can't really do that, but, there's a community organization here. They could do it. And so we did that. And then there were lots of housing that was just not there. And so we went to private developers and said, there are going to be rules about this. Your profit will be limited. You'll be highly regulated, but do you want to play? Again, to just make it a little bit longer, all this housing that was abandoned today, 30-something years later, 99% of it is still occupied and viable. And some of it is owner-occupied, and some of it is community managed, and some of it is private. And it was only possible because the government reached out, and some of it's nonprofit, and some of it's for-profit. None of it is run by the government, but lots of people have affordable housing. So that was sort of way back when. That was a lesson that I learned and never forgot. And years later, Howard Buffett and I ran into each other here. And he had a wildly different life experience than me. But it was right after his grandfather had decided to give up all his money to try to help the world. So he was of a mindset, how could we do this on a mass scale, even though his grandfather had a lot of money? I mean, one of the things that people don't understand, I think many people don't understand in society, is even if all these rich people gave all their money away today, it really is almost a drop in the bucket compared to the size and scope of government and the private market. So the solution, the old idea, let's just level the playing field. Let's take all the rich people's money away and give it to the poor. It wouldn't get us very far.
So what would get us very far?
I think what gets us further and further and further is what we've been talking about since the beginning, is a more collaborative society, which still has three viable sectors: a government sector, a for-profit sector, and a nonprofit sector. I think that's the real balance that we need in society. And that, again, puts all those voices at the table, the business voices at the table, the mass, us as a big entity, and then all these smaller, but the fastest growing sector in the world is the nonprofit social sector, which, by the way, has people who are in the government and people who are in business too. They're also populating that sector, but in that activity, all those people are focused on how can we make society healthier, fairer.
Mm. I have two more questions for you, Bill, if that's all right. My first is, why do you think we have done so badly with COVID? And why do you think that we're in the situation that we're in? And how are you still remaining optimistic? Because I know you're an optimist. And what sort of rituals, what advice can you give to everybody that it's going to be okay, and that, how can they make sure they stay as happy as possible during this difficult period?
Boy, I have so many answers to that. I'll try to focus. One, as an optimist, this is time limited, right? It's like a storm. It's gonna be over. It's gonna be over. Maybe it'll be next summer. Maybe it'll be before that. But first of all, a lot of people are getting infected and they're probably not going to get it again. Secondly, there are going to be vaccines, and that's also going to prevent a lot of the spread. And if you go back 100 years to the analogy that everybody keeps using is the Spanish flu, even when we had no idea what we were doing at all, we got over that. We got through it. Yes, I'm not saying there's no consequences, but this will end. No matter what, this will end. So that's good news number one. Good news number two is there's been a phenomenal lack of leadership. Yes, it begins with Donald Trump. That's an easy one. And so is Bolsonaro. There are a couple of easy villains to pick out, and they are easy and they are villains. But it goes beyond them, right? And part of it is, I think, people's need to try to offset them, like public health officials, like, I won't quite say lying, although I'd like to say that, to offset what crazy things people like Trump say, to say like the crazy thing on the other end, so it like balances it. But instead, what's happened is there is a sea of misinformation. So the average person doesn't know what to believe. And therefore, they are full of fear. Fear is rampant in the United States. It's much worse than the disease. I put that pox on all houses. That's the fault of Trump. That's the fault of elected officials at all levels. That's the fault of the doctors. Because no one has honestly said, this is what we know. This is what we don't know. And no one has even been honest enough to say, yes, you're right. we said masks don't matter. And now we're saying masks are the only thing between us and chaos. That's right. You're right. I said that. I was wrong before, and I'm probably wrong now. And the truth is probably in between. And we don't know exactly what to do. Wearing a mask can't hurt, and maybe it'll help. So do it. Why not? What's the big deal? Once you lose credibility, which I think almost all the major actors in this drama have lost credibility, then you have chaos. And that's what we have. We have chaos. The good news is it will be over. But I don't think it'll be over until the disease either runs its course or we have a vaccine. So.
And finally, Bill, what does happiness mean to you?
Happiness means to me when you wake up in the morning, you are excited. You're excited about another day. Yes, you're listing all the things you got to do today, but at least for a split second, you think, man, isn't it great that I'm alive? Isn't it great that I'm just part of whatever this crazy thing is that we have in the world? So there's so much to just be excited about every day.
That was such a beautiful answer. And I think we're going to wrap it up on that beautiful note. Thank you so much for your time, Bill.
Thank you for having me.